When humankind began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humankind were beautiful. Thus they took wives for themselves from any they chose. So we have two groups here, the sons of God and the daughters of Adam. They saw something that was good or beautiful, and they took what they wanted. Sound familiar? It's what Eve did with the forbidden fruit. She saw that it was good, so she took it with no regard for what God had commanded. It's an illicit taking, and we know from chapter 3 that that is a recipe for death. So who are these two parties? In the first view, the sons of God is the righteous line of Seth, or godly people in general, and the daughters of man is the ungodly line of Cain, or ungodly people in general. So people who should be devoted to God were intermarrying with idol worshippers and forsaking their allegiance to Yahweh. Now there's some credence to that interpretation, since Israel is sometimes called sons of Yahweh. But here's the problem. The phrase used here in Genesis 6 is sons of Elohim. And when that phrase occurs elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, it refers to spiritual beings in the heavenly realm. So the second view is much more compelling, yet more bizarre. The sons of God are divine beings that left their heavenly boundary to unite with humans who are grasping for immortality. This interpretation also illuminates several cryptic New Testament passages. For example, Jude mentions angels who did not keep within their proper domain but abandoned their own place of residence. He then mentions the people of Sodom and Gomorrah who indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire in a way similar to these angels. So the Lord said, "My spirit will not remain in humankind indefinitely, since they are mortal. They will remain for 120 more years." Is this a peak lifespan that people would eventually reach as death continued to take hold? Or was there a period of 120 years between this decree and the time of the flood? Verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after this, when the sons of God were having sexual relations with the daughters of humankind, who gave birth to their children. They were the mighty heroes of old, the famous men. Later scriptures associate these beings with giant clans. They were exalted and renowned, despite being a corruption of God's design. Verse 5 zooms us out to a God's eye view. But the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind had become great on the earth. Every inclination of the thoughts of their minds was only evil all the time. The sons of God saw good and took. But God sees the whole picture, even down to people's thoughts. And unfortunately, people had become wicked and evil.
Hey, what are you doing, pal?
I'm just eating my jelly beans.
Hey, you took my jelly beans, didn't you?
What are you gonna do about it, buddy?
I'm gonna cut your nose off.
We've already seen examples of this evil, unfettered rage that takes, kills, subjugates, threatens, and dominates. The Lord regretted that he had made humankind on the earth, and he was highly offended. He was saddened, grieved, troubled. These are appropriate responses to seeing evil in our world. It also says he regretted. The word here comes from the same roots as nacham, to comfort. He had to console himself. God feels deeply and grieves over sin as it destroys people and creation. Our English word regret implies that someone made a mistake or a bad decision, and that's not what's going on here. God made a good creation. He blessed it. He covered its shame. He called it back to repentance. But when he sees what he makes and loves destroying itself and others, there's a profound sense of loss that comes from knowing there's a better way. Grief is a helpful tool that we've been given to cope with our experience with the evil in the world. What grief does is it validates the goodness of creation. It recognizes loss for what it is. When we allow ourselves to grieve, we agree with God that his creation is good and that our losses really do matter. So the Lord said, "I will wipe humankind whom I have created from the face of the earth. Everything from humankind to animals, including creatures that move on the ground and birds of the air, for I regret that I have made them." He decides to hit the reset button, and it's clearly a painful decision for him. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. So this toledot went from Adam down through his descendants as sin snowballs into this massive avalanche that prompts God to act.
Boys,
But it ends on this note of hope.
that's enough of that.
God doesn't allow death to have the final word. There's a man who will bring comfort. Toledot 3. This is the account of Noah. This might be a good place to discuss flood narratives. Babylon, Sumer, and Egypt all had written flood stories, many of which predate our Genesis account by hundreds of years, based on the evidence we have. These stories have a lot in common with the Noah story. Apparently, there was a shared cultural memory of a cataclysmic flood. Everyone knew it had happened. But the Noah story has theological significance. The Spirit breathed life into this story, and it became a vehicle of divine truth. There's a lot of debate about this flood, and faithful Christians disagree. Was it a historical event, or is this Israel's polemic theologizing of an ancient myth? Was it a global flood, or was it a more regional cataclysm described in hyperbolic, universalizing language? I think it's helpful to consider two foundational questions. One, how does this story fit into the biblical author's overall message? In other words, why is it included in Genesis at all? Number two, what do the New Testament authors take away from this story? Let's take a moment to look at the second one now. In Matthew 24 and Luke 17, Jesus briefly mentions Noah's flood. In context, he's talking about the final judgment and Christ's return. He says, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." He goes on to say, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come." So Jesus' takeaway here is that Noah's flood corresponds to a future reality. It starts a pattern. God's judgment comes when life seems normal, so be ready. These things are true no matter what. So while the debate and speculation might be interesting, let's not make this a gatekeeping issue. Rather, let's look at what this story intends to communicate about God and his people. Which brings us to the second question. What is the Genesis author's original intent? When we talked about creation, I mentioned how elements of this story were designed to show how Yahweh the true God was not like the fickle and bloodthirsty gods of the surrounding nations. We see this again in the flood narratives. Let's look at the Atrahasis epic, for example. In that story, humans were so loud and annoying that the gods couldn't sleep. So the flood was a result of the gods getting annoyed. Contrast this to the God of the Bible, who has very deep concerns about violence and corruption. He made a very good creation that he wants to flourish, and all they do is turn against him. And he's actually heartbroken to have to start again. He brings a flood because the blood of the innocent cry out for justice, and he will act. And then we meet Noah. Noah was a godly man. He was blameless among his contemporaries. He walked with God.
Now, boys, you want to tell me what happened back there? He stabbed me. Again?
He started it.
How?
He ate my jelly beans.
Now, boys, in this family, we do not stab and steal from one another. You both go to your rooms right now.
Dad, I'm 105 years old.
This guy gets three descriptors. One, he was tzaddik, he was godly or righteous. This basically means that he was in right relationships, probably honest, peaceable. Second, he was tamim, he was blameless, which doesn't mean morally perfect. It's more like whole or complete. This word most often occurs in reference to animals fit for sacrifice in the later Mosaic law. This is an interesting term in light of Cain's sacrifice that God rejected in chapter 4. Cain's attitude was a bitterness that led to violence. Now we have Noah living in a violent world, and he stands out as one who resists that cultural milieu to live rightly in his community and world. And third, Noah walked with God. In the last chapter we learned what happens when someone walks with God. Remember Enoch? He walked with God and God took him. And so we're left to ponder, will this guy get taken too? Verse 10, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We already know that. Chapter 5, verse 32 already told us who his sons are. Why leave in the repetition? Well, because this is a story about seeds, about filling and multiplying, about fathers and sons, and the author wants us to pay attention to family lines. What impact will Noah's righteousness have on his descendants? The story continues. The earth was ruined in the sight of God. The earth was filled with violence. Now remember in chapter 1 when God created humanity? He said, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth." It was a blessing to flourish. Do you remember how this chapter started? It said, when humankind began to multiply on the face of the earth. Well, they multiplied all right by crossing cosmic boundaries, and they filled the land all right, but with violence. And God saw how things had turned out, and his assessment was, that's corrupt. It's ruined. It's destroyed because of violence. Cain didn't master his anger, and it propelled him to kill Abel. Lamech didn't value human life, so he gloated in vengeance and threats. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its way on the earth. We keep seeing that word corrupt or ruin. So God said to Noah, I have decided that all living creatures must die, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. A problem presents itself to God, he sees a need, and he acts decisively. So what does God do? Now I am about to destroy them and the earth. That word destroy is our echo word again. Our English translations don't always draw out that repetition, but it's important to notice the way this word echoes through the text. God is grieved because his creation is destroying itself. The earth was ruined, behold it was ruined, all flesh had ruined its way, so God decides to ruin it. That's often how God's judgment is depicted. Humans start the ruining process, and God effectively brings it to an end. He says, okay, if this is what you want, then let's bring it to its natural conclusion. Oh, but here's Noah. He's walking with me, and I have promises to keep. So God says, make for yourself an ark of cypress or gopher wood. This word for wood is eitz, and it's the same Hebrew word that's used to describe trees. The last time we saw an eitz was the tree in the garden in Eden, representing life and death, obedience or destruction. Now we have an eitz that will become life for some. So what's an ark? It's not a boat. It doesn't have sails or oars or a rudder. It's a box.
Well, that's anticlimactic.
Yeah, you could have at least painted over the logo.
What kind of budget do you think we're working with here?
We see the word here in this story, and in the story of baby Moses, who will also be placed on the waters in a basket or a box. This same Hebrew word, it's a container. But there are more connections between Noah and Moses. Both were given a building project, and both followed the instructions just as God had commanded. Both found favor in the eyes of God. The author is purposely drawing connections from the ark to the tabernacle. Make rooms in the ark, or make it with reeds, and cover it with pitch inside and out. The word cover it with pitch is the same word for making atonement, covering over sin. This is how you should make it. The ark is to be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Make a roof for the ark and finish it, leaving 18 inches from the top. My apologies to everyone else in the world using the metric system. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. Notice the 3 tiers of the ark. We're beginning to see the patterning here from the beginning of Genesis. The cosmos is described in 3 realms, the earth, the waters, and the sky or heavens. And God rested. Within the dry land is another 3-tiered sacred space, a tree of life in the middle of a garden in the land of Eden. When they forfeited their right to enjoy the presence of God, he provided another Eden, a 3-tiered ark, where God would confirm his covenant with Noah and the animals. For later readers in Israel, they might see these stories and say, oh, we have a covenant with God under Moses, and our tabernacle is a 3-tiered sacred space where atonement is made. Look at how God worked through all of these events of time and space to preserve his people. Look at how walking with God leads to life. Look at how sin and violence only reaps destruction. God has always been the king in charge. In fact, much later, the psalmist would write these words, "The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord is enthroned as king forever. The Lord gives his people strength. The Lord blesses his people with peace." Back to Genesis. God says, I am about to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy from under the sky all the living creatures that have the breath of life in them. Everything that is on the earth will die, but I will confirm my covenant with you. A covenant is essentially a binding agreement or contract. And here we see that God is initiating this covenant. All Noah does is say yes. He trusts and he obeys, and God promises to keep him alive. And not only Noah, but his family as well. We don't know what kind of faith these family members had. Did they walk with God? The focus isn't on them or even on Noah, who's a pretty flat character in all of this. We're meant to see God's commitment and God's faithfulness. He continues to reach out and pursue restoration. God says, you will enter the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Like in Eden, where the 2 became one flesh, here we have 4 more sets of couples that are meant to be inseparable as they become fruitful and multiply. You must bring into the ark 2 of every kind of living creature from all flesh, male and female, to keep them alive with you. of the birds after their kinds, and of the cattle after their kinds, and of every creeping thing of the ground after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you so you can keep them alive. Notice we have 2 references to keeping creation alive. God still supports the flourishing of his good creation. Male and female are brought in to repopulate the world once the waters have receded. And you must take for yourself every kind of food that is eaten, and gather it together. It will be food for you and for them. And Noah did all that God commanded him. He did indeed. Again, the focus is on God's covenant faithfulness and Noah's obedient response.